The audio recording would haunt Clara Jolie for months afterward. 17 minutes and 43 seconds of her father's voice, captured by the paramedics' standard documentation protocol, choosing his stepdaughter's wedding reception over his own daughter's life-threatening emergency. What made it worse wasn't just the betrayal, it was hearing herself begging, gasping for breath between words, while he explained to the emergency responders why he couldn't leave the party. "She's always been dramatic," his voice crackled through the recording. "Madison's wedding only happens once." Clara had always known she wasn't her father's priority, but she never imagined she'd have 17 minutes and 43 seconds of proof.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The morning of September 15th started like any other Saturday in Clara's small apartment in Riverside, California. At 24, she'd grown accustomed to weekends that stretched endlessly before her. No plans, no expectations, just the quiet companionship of her rescue cat, Milo, and whatever Netflix series could hold her attention. Her father, Robert Jolie, had moved on to his new family 3 years ago when he married Patricia Whitman, a successful real estate agent with a daughter just 2 years older than Clara. Clara remembered the wedding announcement with painful clarity. She'd been working as a junior graphic designer at a small marketing firm, barely making rent on her studio apartment when Robert called with the news. "Patricia and I are getting married next month," he said, his voice carrying that forced cheerfulness he used when he was about to deliver news he knew would hurt. "Small ceremony, family only." Clara had waited for the invitation that never came. When she had finally worked up the courage to ask, Robert explained that Patricia wanted to keep things intimate. Translation, Clara wasn't family anymore, not the kind that mattered. That was 3 years ago. Since then, Clara had built a careful distance from her father's new life. She sent birthday cards to Madison, her stepsister, and exchanged polite text messages with Robert during holidays. It was easier than confronting the growing chasm between them, easier than acknowledging that she'd been replaced. On this particular Saturday, Clara had been experimenting with a new coffee recipe, something involving cinnamon and vanilla that she'd seen on a food blog, when the first wave of nausea hit her like a freight train. She'd been feeling off for a few days, attributing it to stress from a particularly demanding client at work, but this was different. This was urgent and wrong in a way that made her entire body revolt. The cramping started in her abdomen, sharp and insistent, like someone was twisting a knife just below her ribs. Clara doubled over, her coffee mug slipping from her hands and shattering across the kitchen tile. Milo darted away, startled by the crash, as Clara gripped the counter, trying to breathe through what felt like her insides being rearranged by invisible hands. She tried to wait it out. Clara had always been the type to tough things out, to avoid making a fuss. It was a survival mechanism she learned early. Don't be too much trouble, don't ask for too much attention, don't give anyone another reason to look away. But as 20 minutes turned into an hour and the pain intensified rather than subsided, Clara knew she was in real trouble. Her hands shook as she dialed 911, the simple act of pressing 3 numbers feeling monumental. The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional, asking questions Clara struggled to answer between waves of agony. Yes, she was experiencing severe abdominal pain. No, she hadn't eaten anything unusual. Yes, she lived alone. No, there wasn't anyone who could stay with her until the ambulance arrived. That last question stung more than the physical pain. At 24, Clara realized with startling clarity she had constructed a life of careful independence that was really just elaborate isolation. Her college friends had scattered across the country after graduation. Her coworkers were friendly, but not close. Her romantic relationships had been brief and ultimately forgettable. When the chips were down, when she really needed someone, the person she instinctively wanted to call was the same person who had been systematically removing himself from her life for 3 years. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes. Clara would later learn their response time from the incident report. They were professional and kind. Jennifer Martinez, a veteran EMT with kind eyes and steady hands, and David Chen, younger but equally competent. They asked all the right questions, checked her vitals, and quickly determined that whatever was happening required immediate hospital attention. "We need to transport you right away," Jennifer explained, helping Clara onto the stretcher. "Your blood pressure is concerning, and these symptoms could indicate several serious conditions." As they loaded Clara into the ambulance, she found herself asking Jennifer if she could call her father. It wasn't a conscious decision, more of an instinct. A 24-year-old woman reverting to the child who had once believed her father could fix anything.
Jennifer handed Clara her phone, and with trembling fingers, Clara dialed the number she knew by heart. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Clara could hear music and laughter in the background when Robert finally answered. "Clara? What's wrong?" His voice was distracted, impatient. She could picture him stepping away from whatever celebration he was attending, checking his watch, wondering how quickly he could end this call. "Dad, I'm in an ambulance," Clara gasped, the words coming out in short bursts between contractions of pain. "Something's really wrong. The paramedics say I need surgery. Can you meet me at Riverside General?" There was a pause, long enough for Clara to hear someone in the background calling Robert's name, followed by applause and the clinking of glasses. "Clara? Sweetheart, I'm at Madison's wedding reception right now. You know, we talked about this last month. Her big day." His tone was the same one he'd used when she was 16 and had asked him to attend her high school art show on the same night as his golf tournament. Apologetic but firm. Sorry, but not sorry enough to change course. "Dad, please," Clara whispered, aware that Jennifer and David could hear every word. "I'm scared. The paramedics think it might be my appendix or something with my ovaries. They said it could be serious." Another pause. Clara could hear Patricia's voice in the background, asking who was on the phone. "Look, honey, you're 24 years old. You can handle this. The doctors at Riverside General are excellent. Patricia's friend had her gallbladder out there last year. You'll be fine. Madison's only getting married once, and Patricia has put so much work into making this day perfect." Clara felt something crack inside her chest, something that had nothing to do with her physical pain. She looked up at Jennifer, who was monitoring her IV, her professional mask not quite hiding the disapproval in her eyes. "But Dad, what if—" "Clara, I have to go. They're about to cut the cake, and I promise to give a toast. Text me later and let me know how everything goes, okay? Love you." The line went dead before Clara could respond. She stared at the phone in her hand, the black screen reflecting her pale, sweaty face, and felt a peculiar sense of clarity settle over her, despite the physical agony. Jennifer reached over and gently took the phone from Claire's hands. "I'm sorry, honey. Some people don't know how to show up when it matters." David glanced back from the driver's seat. "We've got you, Clara. Whatever's going on, we're going to get you the help you need." As the ambulance navigated through Saturday evening traffic, sirens wailing, Clara closed her eyes and tried to process what had just happened. This wasn't the first time her father had chosen his new family over her, but it was the most stark, the most documented. Somewhere in the paramedics' official report, Robert's words would be recorded. His dismissal, his priorities, his casual cruelty wrapped in the language of practicality. The pain in Clara's abdomen continued to pulse and twist, but it was nothing compared to the realization that was crystallizing in her mind with each passing mile. She had spent 3 years making excuses for her father, telling herself that blended families were complicated, that Robert was just trying to make his new marriage work. She'd convinced herself that his distance was temporary, that eventually they would find their way back to each other. But 24 years old, alone in an ambulance, listening to her father choose a wedding cake over her potential surgery, Clara finally understood the truth she had been avoiding. This wasn't about timing or circumstances or the complications of divorce and remarriage. This was about choice. And Robert had been making the same choice over and over again for 3 years. As they pulled into the emergency bay at Riverside General Hospital, Clara made a choice of her own. Whatever was happening to her body, whatever surgery or treatment lay ahead, she was done waiting for her father to remember that she existed. She was done making herself smaller to accommodate his new life. She was done being grateful for scraps of attention from the man who had once promised her she would always be his little girl. The paramedics wheeled Clara through the automatic doors, past the bright lights and antiseptic smells of the ER and into whatever came next. For the first time in 3 years, Clara wasn't thinking about her father's approval or his new family's comfort. She was thinking about survival. Not just the physical kind, but the deeper, more fundamental kind that meant learning to live without waiting for someone else to choose her. The spark had been lit. Not the way Clara had ever imagined it would be, not through inspiration or opportunity or love, but through the brutal clarity that comes when someone you've been protecting finally stops protecting you in return. As the medical team took over her care, Clara held on to that spark, nurturing it against the pain and the fear and the 17 minutes and 43 seconds of recorded proof that she was finally, completely on her own.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The fluorescent lights of Riverside General's surgical recovery ward buzzed with an intensity that made Clara's head pound. 3 days had passed since her emergency appendectomy. 3 days of morphine-dulled consciousness and the steady parade of medical staff checking her vitals. What the doctors had initially suspected as appendicitis had turned out to be something far more serious, a twisted ovarian cyst that had been slowly rupturing, poisoning her system and threatening her fertility. Dr. Sarah Kim, the surgeon who had operated on Clara, was a woman in her 40s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of direct manner that Clara found both comforting and intimidating. She had explained the procedure in detail, how close Clara had come to sepsis, how waiting even another hour could have meant losing her ovary entirely, possibly affecting her ability to have children in the future. "You're lucky your roommate called when she did," Dr. Kim had said during her post-surgery visit, not realizing that Clara lived alone and had no roommate to speak of. Clara hadn't corrected her. It was easier to let the medical staff believe there was someone in her life who cared enough to notice when she was missing, someone who would worry and call for help. The alternative, explaining that she had dragged herself to her phone and called 911 while writhing on her kitchen floor, seemed too pathetic to voice aloud. Now, on Wednesday morning, Clara was finally alert enough to process the stack of paperwork on her bedside table. Insurance forms, discharge instructions, follow-up appointment schedules, and buried beneath it all, a manila envelope marked Patient Advocacy Services. Inside was a USB drive and a letter explaining that, per hospital policy, all emergency calls involving family notification were recorded and documented for quality assurance purposes. Clara stared at the USB drive, no bigger than her thumb, containing 17 minutes and 43 seconds that would change everything. She hadn't asked for this documentation, didn't even know it existed until now. But hospital policy was hospital policy, and Patient Advocacy Services had determined she had a right to know what had been said during her medical emergency. Her phone had buzzed intermittently for 3 days. Text messages from her father, increasingly worried as she failed to respond. "Hope everything went well at the hospital," the first one had read. "Let me know you're okay," said the second. By the third day, his messages had taken on a defensive tone. "Clara, you're worrying me. Patricia thinks maybe you're being dramatic about this whole hospital thing. Just call me back." Patricia thinks. That phrase had become the unofficial motto of Clara's relationship with her father. Patricia thinks Clara should be more understanding about blended families. Patricia thinks Clara needs to make more of an effort with Madison. Patricia thinks Clara is holding on to childish resentment about the divorce. And now, apparently, Patricia thinks Clara is being dramatic about her emergency surgery. The irony wasn't lost on Clara that Patricia, a woman who had once called an ambulance because she thought she was having a heart attack, but turned out to have heartburn from spicy food, was now diagnosing Clara's legitimate medical crisis as attention-seeking behavior.
Clara's hospital room had seen a steady stream of visitors, though none of them were family. Jennifer Martinez, the EMT from Saturday night, had stopped by on her off day to check on Clara's recovery. "I've been doing this job for 12 years, she said as she settled into the uncomfortable visitor's chair. "I've seen a lot of family dynamics play out in crisis situations, but I want you to know that what happened in that ambulance, that wasn't normal, Clara. That wasn't okay." Dr. David Chen, the other paramedic, had sent a card through the hospital's patient services. Inside, he'd written a simple message: "Your strength impressed us all. Recovery takes time, but you've got this." Even Dr. Martinez from the ER had made an unscheduled visit, bringing Clara a small succulent plant in a ceramic pot painted with encouraging words. "Patients who advocate for themselves heal faster," she had explained with a knowing smile. "And sometimes the family we choose is more important than the family we were born with." These gestures of kindness from strangers made Clara's father's absence all the more glaring. She had undergone major surgery, spent 3 days in the hospital, and faced the possibility of losing her fertility, all without a single visit from the man who had once promised to protect her from everything. On Wednesday afternoon, Clara's phone rang with an incoming call from Robert. She stared at his contact photo, a selfie they'd taken 2 Christmases ago, both of them smiling and wearing matching Santa hats that Patricia had bought for the whole family. Clara looked younger in the photo, more hopeful. Robert looked like a father. Against her better judgment, Clara answered. "Clara, thank God. I've been worried sick about you." His voice carried that familiar mixture of relief and irritation that Clara remembered from her teenage years. "Why haven't you been answering my calls?" "I had major surgery, Dad. I've been in the hospital since Saturday night." There was a pause. Clara could hear the television in the background, some cooking show that Patricia liked to watch. "Surgery, but I thought you said it was her appendix or something. That's routine, right? People get their appendix out all the time." Clara closed her eyes, feeling the familiar exhaustion that came with trying to explain her reality to her father. "It wasn't my appendix. It was a twisted ovarian cyst. It had been rupturing for days. Dr. Kim said if I had waited much longer, I could have gone into sepsis. I could have died, Dad."
"Well, obviously you didn't die. You're talking to me right now." Robert's tone was shifting toward the defensive pitch Clara knew so well. "Look, sweetheart, I'm sorry I couldn't make it to the hospital on Saturday. Madison's wedding was, well, you know how important that was to Patricia and to Madison. She specifically asked me to give a toast about welcoming her into our family." Our family. The phrase hit Clara like a physical blow. Robert had never used that phrase to describe himself and Clara. They had been father and daughter, sure, but never our family in the way that mattered. Never the kind of family that Patricia and Madison represented. "I have the recording, Dad." The words came out before Clara could stop them, surprising them both. "What recording?" "The paramedics document everything. Every call they make, every conversation they have during an emergency transport. I have 17 minutes and 43 seconds of you telling them that I'm dramatic, that Madison's wedding only happens once, that I can handle a medical emergency by myself because I'm 24 years old." The silence stretched so long that Clara wondered if the call had dropped. When Robert finally spoke, his voice had taken on the careful, measured tone he used when he was preparing to rewrite history. "Clara, you have to understand, I was in a difficult position. Patricia had spent months planning that reception. Madison was so nervous about everything going perfectly. I thought, you sounded upset, but you didn't sound like you were dying or anything. I was begging you to come to the hospital. You were emotional. You've always been emotional, even when you were little. Remember when you broke your arm and cried for hours even after the doctor said it was just a minor fracture?" Clara felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. This was how it always went with Robert. Her feelings were always too big, her needs always too much, her pain always exaggerated. Even now, even with medical documentation of her life-threatening emergency, he was reframing her experience as an overreaction.
Dad, I almost lost my ovary. The doctor said I was maybe an hour away from sepsis. This wasn't emotional. This was medical fact. Well, you're fine now, aren't you? That's what matters. Patricia and I were just saying how resilient you are, how you've always been able to take care of yourself. It's actually a compliment in a way. Clara stared at the ceiling, counting the tiny holes in the acoustic tiles above her bed. Somewhere in those holes, she was sure was the answer to why she kept having the same conversation with her father over and over again. Why she kept expecting him to suddenly understand, to suddenly prioritize her, to suddenly become the father she needed him to be. I'm going to be in the hospital for another 2 days. I have follow-up appointments for the next month. I'm going to need help with grocery shopping and cleaning until I'm fully healed. Of course, honey, whatever you need. Patricia and I are happy to help however we can. But even as he said the words, Clara could hear the distance in them, the automatic reassurance that wasn't really an offer so much as a pleasant-sounding deflection. She had learned to recognize the difference between her father saying he would help and her father actually helping. I have to go, Dad. The nurse is here with my medication. This was a lie, but Clara needed the conversation to end before she said something she couldn't take back. Okay, sweetheart, get some rest. Love you. Love you too. After she hung up, Clara sat in the silence of her hospital room, holding the USB drive that contained the most honest conversation she'd ever had with her father. The conversation where he hadn't been performing for her benefit, where he had revealed exactly how he saw her and her place in his life. The resistance she was feeling wasn't just about this one incident. It was about 3 years of making excuses for him, 3 years of accepting less and less of his attention, 3 years of convincing herself that his neglect was somehow her fault. It was about the fundamental impossibility of changing someone who didn't see that change was necessary. Dr. Kim knocked and entered, carrying Clara's chart and wearing the expression of someone who had difficult news to deliver. Clara, I need to talk to you about your recovery timeline and some concerns I have about your support system at home. The social worker mentioned that you live alone and don't have family nearby to help with your post-surgical care. Clara looked down at the USB drive in her hands, then back at Dr. Kim's concerned face. That's right. It's just me. For the first time in years, Clara felt the strange relief that came with telling the complete truth. It was just her. It had been just her for a long time, even when she was pretending otherwise. The recording on the USB drive was simply documentation of what she had always known but never wanted to admit. When it really mattered, when her life was literally on the line, she was on her own. The resistance Clara was feeling wasn't about accepting help or healing or moving forward. The resistance was to continuing to live in the fantasy that her father would someday choose her, that Patricia would someday see her as family, that Madison would someday think of her as a real sister rather than an inconvenient reminder of Robert's previous life. As Dr. Kim began explaining discharge procedures and follow-up care, Clara made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She was going to stop resisting the truth. She was going to stop fighting for a relationship that existed only in her imagination. She was going to stop making herself smaller to fit into a family that had no room for her. The recording would be her proof, not just for the world, but for herself. 17 minutes and 43 seconds of evidence that she had been asking for the right thing, love, support, priority, from the wrong person. It was time to stop asking. The law office of Morrison, Patel & Associates occupied the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian house in downtown Riverside, its waiting room decorated with an eclectic mix of modern furniture and vintage artwork that somehow managed to feel both professional and welcoming. Clara sat in one of the leather chairs, her discharge papers from the hospital folded neatly in her purse, alongside the USB drive that had become her constant companion over the past week. She hadn't planned to consult a lawyer. The idea had come from an unexpected source.
her neighbor, Mrs. Elena Vasquez, an 82-year-old retired teacher who had noticed Clara struggling to carry groceries up the stairs to her apartment. Elena had knocked on Clara's door the day after she'd returned from the hospital, carrying a casserole dish and wearing the determined expression of someone who wouldn't take no for an answer. "Mija, you look like death warmed over," Elena had announced, pushing past Clara into the small apartment. "When was the last time you ate something that didn't come from a hospital tray?" Over the course of that afternoon, Elena had managed to extract the entire story from Clara. The emergency surgery, the phone call, the recording, her father's continued absence from her recovery. Elena had listened with the focused attention of someone accustomed to hearing teenagers' problems and identifying the real issues beneath the surface drama. "You know what this reminds me of?" Elena had said, settling into Clara's small couch with a cup of tea. "My grandson Miguel's custody battle 3 years ago. His ex-wife was documenting everything. Every missed pickup, every late payment, every broken promise. She said evidence doesn't lie the way people do." That comment had lodged itself in Clara's mind, growing stronger each day. Evidence doesn't lie the way people do. Clara had spent years accepting her father's version of events, his explanations and justifications and reframings of their relationship. But now she had something he couldn't explain away or reinterpret, an official medical record and audio documentation of his choices in a life-threatening emergency. Elena had suggested Clara speak with her grandson's lawyer, a young woman named Rebecca Patel, who specialized in family law and had a reputation for taking cases that other attorneys might consider too emotionally complex or financially modest to pursue. "She doesn't just think about the law," Elena had explained. "She thinks about what's right." Now, sitting in Rebecca's waiting room, Clara felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that came with making decisions her father wouldn't approve of. For 24 years, she had unconsciously filtered her choices through the question of how Robert would react, what he would think, whether it would create tension in his new marriage. This was the first major decision she was making purely for herself. Rebecca Patel was younger than Clara had expected, probably in her early 30s with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she had heard every variety of family dysfunction and wasn't easily shocked. Her walls were covered with framed letters from former clients, thank you notes from children, and a single diploma from UCLA Law School. "Mrs. Vasquez speaks very highly of you," Rebecca said, gesturing for Clara to take a seat across from her desk. "She mentioned you're dealing with some family issues that might have legal implications." Clara had rehearsed this conversation in her head dozens of times, but actually sitting in a lawyer's office made everything feel more real and more overwhelming. She pulled out the USB drive and the hospital paperwork, setting them on Rebecca's desk like evidence in a trial she hadn't known she was preparing for. "I'm not sure if this is actually a legal issue," Clara began, then corrected herself. "Actually, I guess I don't know what kind of issue this is. I just know that something happened that feels wrong and I have documentation of it, and I don't know what to do with that." Rebecca listened without interruption as Clara explained the emergency surgery, the phone call, her father's absence throughout her hospital stay and recovery. When Clara played a portion of the recording, just the part where Robert dismissed her emergency as drama and explained why Madison's wedding took priority, Rebecca's expression remained professionally neutral, though Clara caught her making several notes. "This is a very clear recording," Rebecca said when the audio ended. "The paramedics did excellent documentation. Can you tell me what outcome you're hoping for? Are you considering a lawsuit against your father?" Clara shook her head quickly. "I don't want to sue him. I don't want his money or... I don't think I want to hurt him legally. She struggled to find the words. "I think I want him to understand what he did. I want him to hear what I heard, to know that there's proof of how he treats me. I want him to have to acknowledge it instead of pretending it didn't happen or that I'm being too sensitive." Rebecca leaned back in her chair, considering. "What you're describing sounds less like a legal remedy and more like a family intervention, though there are some legal aspects we should discuss." Over the next hour, Rebecca walked Clara through several options. The recording and medical documentation could potentially support a case for emotional distress,
particularly given the medical severity of the situation. More importantly, Rebecca explained, Clara had grounds to demand changes in how her father's estate planning documents were structured, particularly regarding medical emergency contacts and healthcare directives.
Right now, if something happened to your father, who would be making his medical decisions? Rebecca asked. Patricia, I guess. They're married. And if something happened to you? Clara paused, realizing she had never updated her own medical directives since turning 18. Actually, I think it might still list my father as my emergency contact. Rebecca nodded knowingly. This is actually more common than you'd think. Adult children often leave their parents as emergency contacts long after those parents have demonstrated they can't or won't fulfill that responsibility. The recording you have proves that your father cannot be trusted to prioritize your medical needs in an emergency. This revelation felt like another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Clara had been so focused on her father's betrayal that she hadn't considered the practical implications. She was 24 years old, with no romantic partner, no close family relationships, and emergency contacts that led to people who had proven they wouldn't show up when she needed them most. What would you recommend? Clara asked. Rebecca pulled out a legal pad and began sketching out a plan. First, we update all of your medical directives and emergency contacts. Mrs. Vasquez mentioned she'd be willing to serve as your local emergency contact, and we can set up a network of people who actually care about your well-being. Second, we prepare a formal letter to your father with copies of the recording and medical documentation, requesting that he remove you from his emergency contacts and estate planning, since he's demonstrated he cannot fulfill those responsibilities. Won't that make him angry? Probably. But Clara, he was willing to let you potentially die alone in a hospital so he wouldn't miss a wedding toast. His anger is not your responsibility to manage anymore. Rebecca's words hit Clara with unexpected force. For years, she had treated her father's emotions as her responsibility. His comfort with her presence in his new family, his stress about balancing his old and new relationships, his guilt about the divorce. She had made herself smaller and smaller, asking for less and less, all in the service of managing Robert's emotional comfort. There's something else we should discuss, Rebecca continued. The recording you have is powerful evidence, but it's also private medical information. If you decide to use it publicly, say if you wanted to share it with other family members or post it online, there could be legal implications. We'd need to be very careful about how and when you choose to reveal it. Clara hadn't considered the possibility of sharing the recording beyond this legal consultation. The idea of her extended family hearing her father's dismissive words, of Patricia's friends learning how Robert had behaved during her medical emergency, felt both terrifying and appealing. I think I just want him to know that I know. I want him to understand that his words were documented, that there's proof of what kind of father he is. I don't necessarily want to destroy him, but I want him to stop being able to pretend that he's a good dad who's just trying to balance a complicated family situation. Rebecca nodded and made more notes. We can craft a letter that makes it clear you have documentation without necessarily threatening to use it publicly. Think of it as establishing new boundaries with evidence to back them up. Over the next 30 minutes, Rebecca outlined a comprehensive plan. Clara would update all of her legal documents to reflect her current reality rather than her wishful thinking about her father. She would formally request to be removed from any of Robert's emergency contacts or estate considerations. Most importantly, she would establish a clear boundary. Robert could remain in her life if he chose to acknowledge what had happened and make genuine amends, but the relationship would no longer operate under the pretense that his behavior had been acceptable. This isn't about punishment, Rebecca explained as they wrapped up the consultation. It's about reality. You're establishing a relationship based on truth rather than hope. As Clara left the law office, she felt a strange combination of fear and relief. For the first time in years, she was taking action instead of waiting for her father to change, making choices instead of accepting whatever crumbs of attention he was willing to offer. She was, Rebecca had pointed out, finally treating herself like someone who mattered. The walk back to her apartment took her past the park where she and Robert used to feed ducks when she was little. back when Saturday afternoons meant undivided attention and promises that she would always be her little girl. Clara paused at the pond, watching a family with young children tossing bread to the eager waterfowl. The father in this family was crouched down at his daughter's level, showing her how to break the bread into small pieces, laughing when she threw an entire slice at once and sent the ducks into a frenzy. When the little girl stumbled backward in excitement, he caught her easily, steadying her with gentle hands and encouraging words. Clara realized she was crying, but not from sadness. She was grieving the father she had always hoped Robert would become, but she was also acknowledging the father he had actually been, distracted, conditional, always with one foot out the door towards something more important. The recording hadn't revealed anything new about Robert. It had simply made undeniable what Clara had always known but refused to accept. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Elena. "How did it go with the lawyer, mija?" Clara typed back, "Good. Really good. I'm taking the first step." As she walked the remaining blocks to her apartment, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The solid ground of making a decision based on reality rather than hope, of choosing action over waiting, of finally treating herself with the importance she deserved. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure, but it was undeniably movement forward. The first step was always the hardest, Clara thought, as she climbed the stairs to her apartment. But it was also the only way to start walking towards a life where she mattered to the people who mattered to her.
3 weeks after her surgery, Clara received the letter back from her father's attorney. The crisp legal letterhead of Whitman and Associates, Patricia's brother's law firm, felt like a deliberate insult, though Clara supposed it made sense that Robert would turn to his wife's family for legal advice rather than handle the situation directly. The letter was 2 pages of dense legal language that essentially boiled down to a single message. Robert Jolie denied any wrongdoing regarding his daughter's medical emergency and refused to acknowledge the validity of any recordings obtained without his consent. Furthermore, the letter stated, any attempt to share said recordings publicly would result in immediate legal action for invasion of privacy and defamation of character. Clara read the letter 3 times, sitting at her small kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold between her hands. Her first emotion was familiar disappointment, the same feeling she'd carried since childhood when her father chose the easy path over the right one. But underneath that disappointment was something newer and more energizing: anger. Not the hot, reactive anger that had flared up in the hospital, but a steady, purposeful fury that felt like fuel. Robert hadn't just dismissed her emergency, now he was threatening her for having proof of it. He was using Patricia's family's legal connections to intimidate her into silence, to make sure his version of events remained unchallenged. Clara had spent the past 3 weeks learning to navigate life without expecting her father's support, and the process had been more difficult than she'd anticipated. Simple tasks like grocery shopping became exhausting when she was still healing from surgery. Laundry felt monumental when bending over to load the washing machine sent sharp pains through her abdomen. Even cooking basic meals required more energy than she possessed most days. But she had also discovered something unexpected. Other people were willing to help in ways her father never had been. Elena Vasquez had established herself as an unofficial caretaker, bringing Clara homemade meals and staying to chat while she ate them. Through these conversations, Clara learned that Elena had raised 4 children as a single mother after her husband died in a construction accident, that she had put herself through night school to become a teacher, and that she had a profound understanding of what it meant to rebuild your life when the people you counted on disappeared. The hardest part isn't learning to do things alone, Elena had told her one afternoon while helping Clara organize her medications. The hardest part is learning to trust that you deserve better than what you've been accepting. Jennifer Martinez, the paramedic, had also stayed in touch, checking on Clara's recovery through text messages and offering practical advice about healing from abdominal surgery. Jennifer had 3 children of her own and a husband who worked night shifts as a security guard, yet she somehow found time to remind Clara about follow-up appointments and encourage her to rest when she pushed herself too hard.
"You know what I've learned in this job?" Jennifer had texted after Clara mentioned feeling guilty for needing help with basic tasks. The people who apologize for needing help are usually the ones who deserve it most. And the people who demand help are usually the ones who've never had to ask for it. These relationships with Elena, with Jennifer, even with Rebecca Patel, who had started checking in between their legal meetings, were teaching Clara something fundamental about how care was supposed to work. It wasn't supposed to be conditional on convenience or dependent on whether helping her made other people look good. It wasn't supposed to require her to minimize her needs or manage other people's emotions about meeting those needs. Dr. Kim had also become an unexpected source of support during Clara's follow-up appointments. During her 2-week checkup, when Clara mentioned that she was struggling with anxiety about living alone after a medical emergency, Dr. Kim had referred her to a support group for young adults dealing with family estrangement. "It's more common than you think," Dr. Kim had explained. "Adult children who have to create their own support systems because their family of origin can't or won't provide appropriate care. The group meets at the community center on Thursday evenings." Clara's first support group meeting was awkward and overwhelming. The community center's conference room smelled of coffee and industrial carpet, and the circle of folding chairs felt too much like the group therapy sessions her high school guidance counselor had recommended after her parents' divorce. But as the evening progressed and she listened to other people's stories, Clara began to understand that her experience with Robert wasn't unique or especially dramatic. It was one variation on a common theme.
Marcus Thompson, a 28-year-old teacher, described his mother's reaction when he'd been hospitalized with pneumonia the previous year. She'd been too busy with her new boyfriend's family reunion to visit, then later accused Marcus of creating drama when he'd expressed hurt about her absence. Sarah Chen, a 31-year-old nurse, shared how her father had missed her college graduation because it conflicted with his stepson's Little League championship game, then spent years insisting that Clara was holding a grudge when she brought up the disappointment. Listening to these stories, Clara realized that her father's behavior followed a predictable pattern that had nothing to do with her specifically, and everything to do with his inability to prioritize anything that required emotional effort or temporary discomfort. "The hardest part," said the group facilitator, a therapist named Dr. Lisa Rodriguez, "is often accepting that the person you're trying to have a relationship with doesn't actually exist. The loving, supportive parent you keep hoping they'll become is a fantasy. The relationship has to be based on who they actually are, not who you need them to be." This concept, building relationships based on reality rather than potential, became Clara's focus over the following weeks. She began applying it to every interaction with her father, every text message and phone call. Instead of hearing his promises and hoping they meant change was coming, Clara started listening to his actual behavior patterns and making decisions accordingly. When Robert texted suggesting they have lunch once things calm down, his code for once Clara stopped being upset about his behavior, Clara responded with a specific invitation. "I'm free this Saturday at 1 p.m. for lunch at Garden Cafe downtown. I'll be there until 2 p.m. No negotiation, no accommodation for his schedule, no open-ended availability that would allow him to cancel last minute." Robert didn't show up. He texted an hour after their scheduled meeting time to explain that Patricia had surprised him with tickets to a wine tasting event that afternoon, and could they reschedule for sometime soon. 3 months earlier, Clara would have spent the rest of the weekend analyzing what she had done wrong, how she could have been more flexible, whether her choice of restaurant or timing had somehow sabotaged the meeting. Now, sitting alone at Garden Cafe with a spinach salad and a good book, Clara felt something close to satisfaction. She had made a clear offer based on her availability and needs. Robert had chosen not to meet it. The failure of their lunch wasn't her responsibility to fix. That evening, Clara called Rebecca to discuss the next steps in their legal strategy. The letter from Robert's attorney had actually strengthened their position because it demonstrated that he was aware of the conversation and concerned enough about its contents to involve legal counsel.
He's not denying that the conversation happened. He's just trying to control whether anyone else gets to hear it. That suggests he knows how it sounds to objective listeners. They decided to proceed with a more formal boundary-setting process. Rebecca would draft a comprehensive letter outlining Clara's new expectations for their relationship. Robert could continue to be her father, but only if he was willing to acknowledge what had happened during her medical emergency, apologize specifically for his choices, and demonstrate through consistent actions that he understood the impact of his behavior. "What if he refuses?" Clara asked. "Then you'll have clarity," Rebecca said simply. "Right now, you're stuck in this gray area where he gets to maintain the illusion that he's a good father while treating you poorly. This letter forces him to choose. Either be the father you deserve, or stop pretending to be a father at all." The letter took 2 weeks to draft and revise. Rebecca was meticulous about the language, ensuring that every request was reasonable and specific, every consequence was proportional and enforceable. They included a deadline. Robert had 30 days to respond with either a genuine acknowledgement and plan for change, or a clear statement that he preferred to end their relationship rather than address his behavior. The night before they sent the letter, Clara lay awake thinking about the girl she had been 3 months ago, the girl who had called her father from an ambulance, still believing that love meant always being available for other people's emergencies, while accepting that they might not be available for yours. She thought about the woman she was becoming, someone who had learned to ask for help from people who actually wanted to help, someone who could sit alone in a restaurant without feeling like she was being punished, someone who understood that loving herself meant refusing to accept treatment that diminished her worth. The learning curve had been steep and often painful, but Clara was beginning to understand that growing up wasn't just about age. It was about learning to distinguish between the relationships that nourished her and the ones that left her perpetually hungry for more. It was about building a life based on what was real, rather than what she hoped might someday become real. As she finally drifted off to sleep, her last conscious thought was about the letter that would be delivered to her father's office the next morning. For the first time in their relationship, she would be setting the terms. For the first time in her adult life, Clara Jolie was choosing herself. The 30-day deadline came and went without any response from Robert. Clara had expected this outcome. Her father had never been one to meet uncomfortable deadlines. But the silence still hit harder than she'd anticipated. She had given him a clear choice between acknowledging his behavior and losing their relationship entirely, and he had chosen a third option, pretending the choice didn't exist. On the 31st day, Clara was reorganizing her small home office when she discovered something that changed everything. Tucked inside an old photo album she hadn't opened in years were the custody papers from her parents' divorce, documents she'd never actually read as a 16-year-old, but had kept among her important papers out of some vague sense that they might matter someday. Reading them now, with adult eyes and painful new context, Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The custody agreement outlined specific provisions for medical emergencies. Robert was legally required to be available for any serious medical situation involving his minor daughter, and failure to respond could result in modification of custody arrangements and financial responsibilities. More devastating was the section about emotional support during health crises. The agreement, negotiated by her mother's attorney after Robert had missed Clara's appendicitis scare at age 14, explicitly stated that both parents would prioritize their daughter's medical needs above social obligations, work commitments, or other family activities. Clara realized with growing horror that Robert's abandonment during her emergency surgery wasn't just morally wrong, it was legally identical to a pattern of behavior that had been serious enough to require court intervention when she was a minor. The only difference now was that she was 24 instead of 16, which meant the law no longer protected her from his neglect. She called Rebecca immediately, scanning the custody papers as she waited for the lawyer to answer. "Rebecca, I found something. Court documents from my parents' divorce that show my dad has done this before. There's literally a legal provision about him missing medical emergencies because of social events. Rebecca's response was immediate. Bring those papers in this afternoon. This changes everything. The drive to Rebecca's office felt different this time. Clara wasn't just seeking advice or comfort. She was carrying evidence that recontextualized her entire childhood and her relationship with her father. The pattern she'd always sensed but never been able to articulate was laid out in black and white legal language, complete with dates and specific incidents. This is extraordinary, Rebecca said, reviewing the documents while Clara sat across from her desk. Your mother's attorney was incredibly thorough. Look at this section here. It documents 3 separate incidents where your father missed or minimized medical situations involving you. The appendicitis at 14, the concussion from your bike accident at 15, and a severe allergic reaction at 16. Clara felt a strange disconnection from her own history. She remembered those incidents, of course, but she had accepted Robert's explanations at the time. He'd been at an important work conference, then a golf tournament with potential clients, then Patricia's birthday dinner during the early days of their relationship. Clara had never questioned whether these conflicts were genuine scheduling issues or deliberate choices. What's most significant, Rebecca continued, is this clause about establishing a pattern of emotional neglect during health crises. The court found that your father's behavior was not only harmful to you, but indicative of a deeper inability to prioritize parental responsibilities during stressful situations. The full implications began to sink in as Rebecca explained how the custody modification had worked. Robert had been required to attend family therapy, complete a co-parenting education program, and agreed to specific protocols for future medical situations. He had complied with the minimum requirements to maintain his custody rights, but the moment Clara turned 18 and aged out of the legal protections, he had apparently reverted to his previous patterns. The most disturbing aspect, Rebecca noted, is that he clearly understood the impact of his behavior. The court documents show he acknowledged the harm he was causing and agreed to change. This wasn't ignorance or poor judgment. This was a conscious choice to resume harmful behavior once there were no longer legal consequences. That afternoon, Clara did something she hadn't done since her mother's death 2 years earlier. She drove to Sunset Memorial Cemetery and sat by her mother's grave. The headstone was a simple granite with her mother's name, dates, and the phrase, "beloved mother," that Clara had chosen because it felt true in a way that more elaborate sentiments hadn't. Linda had died of breast cancer at 51, a 2-year battle that had consumed most of Clara's senior year of college. During those final months, Robert had been nominally present but emotionally absent, visiting the hospital when it was convenient, and delegating most of Clara's emotional support to Patricia, who had approached the situation with the efficiency of someone managing an unpleasant but temporary obligation. Sitting on the bench beside her mother's grave, Clara realized that Linda had tried to protect her, even from beyond death. The custody agreement, with its specific protections and detailed documentation of Robert's failures, had been her mother's way of creating legal consequences for behavior she knew would continue after she was gone. "You tried to warn me, didn't you, Mom?" Clara said aloud, feeling slightly foolish, but needing to voice the realization. "You made sure there was a paper trail so I'd eventually understand this wasn't about me."
The wind rustled through the oak trees planted throughout the cemetery, and Clara felt something settle in her chest. Not peace, exactly, but a kind of grim clarity. Her mother had fought for her even while dying, had used her limited energy to build legal protections that would reveal the truth about Robert's character when Clara was old enough to understand it. That evening, Clara made a decision that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. She printed copies of the custody documents, the hospital records, the recorded conversation, and her father's threatening legal letter. She arranged them in chronological order, creating a timeline that told the complete story of Robert Jolie's pattern of medical neglect spanning over a decade.
Then she called Madison. Her stepsister answered on the second ring, her voice bright with the casual confidence of someone whose father had never missed her important moments. "Clara! Oh my God, I heard you were in the hospital. Dad said it was your appendix. Are you feeling better?" "Actually, Madison, that's not exactly what happened. Can we meet for coffee tomorrow? There are some things about your wedding weekend that I think you should know." Madison agreed, though Clara could hear the wariness creeping into her voice. They arranged to meet at a neutral location, a cafe halfway between their apartments that neither of them had history with. The conversation with Madison was unlike any they'd ever had. For years, Clara had treated her stepsister with careful politeness, never wanting to create tension in Robert's new family or give Patricia ammunition for complaints about Clara's attitude. But sitting across from Madison at Corner Cafe, Clara found herself telling the truth without editing it for palatability. Madison listened with increasing shock as Clara explained the severity of her medical emergency, played portions of the recorded phone conversation, and showed her the custody documents that revealed this was part of a long-standing pattern. "I don't understand," Madison said, her wedding ring catching the afternoon sunlight as she gestured. "Dad told us you had a minor procedure and were being overdramatic about it. He said you were upset that he didn't visit the hospital, but that you were fine and just wanted attention." "I nearly died, Madison. I was an hour away from sepsis when they operated on me. Your wedding reception was more important to him than my life." Madison stared at the hospital discharge papers Clara had brought, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that looked like recognition. "The night of my wedding, when he got that phone call, he seemed annoyed, but he said it was just you overreacting to a stomach bug or something. He made this big speech about how proud he was to officially welcome me into the family and how some people try to steal attention from important moments." Clara felt her stomach clench, though not from surgical pain this time. Robert hadn't just dismissed her emergency, he had actively reframed it for his new family as attention-seeking behavior, painting Clara as the villain in the story of Madison's perfect wedding day. "Clara, I need you to understand something. I'm not telling you this to hurt you or to ruin your memories of your wedding. I'm telling you because you deserve to know who your stepfather really is when someone he's supposed to love is in crisis." The conversation continued for 2 hours, Madison asking questions that revealed just how thoroughly Robert had constructed a false narrative about Clara's character and needs. According to the version Madison had been told, Clara was jealous of the new family's happiness, prone to creating emergencies for attention, and unwilling to accept that Robert had moved on with his life. "I feel sick," Madison said, pushing away her untouched latte. "All these years I thought you just didn't like us. I thought you were cold or resentful. But if what you're showing me is true, it's documented, Madison. The hospital records, the legal papers, the recording, it's all verifiable." Madison was quiet for a long moment, staring out the cafe window at the street beyond. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and shaken. "If he could do this to you, if he could lie about something this serious, what else has he lied about? What else don't I know about the man my mother married?" That question hung between them as they parted ways, Madison promising to think about everything Clara had shared, while Clara drove home with the strange exhaustion that comes from finally telling a truth you've been avoiding for years. Later that evening, Clara received a call from Patricia. Robert's wife didn't bother with pleasantries. "Clara, Madison is very upset about your conversation today. She's questioning things that should never be questioned, and she's making wild accusations about Robert's character. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but it needs to stop." "I showed her documented medical records and legal papers, Patricia. I didn't make anything up." You're manipulating the situation to hurt our family. Robert has been nothing but generous and patient with you, and this is how you repay him, by trying to turn his stepdaughter against him?" Clara found herself laughing, though there was no humor in it. "Patricia, he chose your daughter's wedding cake over my emergency surgery. There's a recording of him saying I'm dramatic while paramedics were preparing to operate on me to save my life. I'm not manipulating anything. I'm just not hiding the truth anymore." The truth, according to you. Your truth. There are always two sides to every story, Clara. Actually, in this case, there are hospital records and audio documentation. Those don't really have sides. Patricia hung up without saying goodbye, but not before she heard her muttering something about ungrateful children and stirring up trouble. Sitting in her apartment afterwards, Clara felt the full weight of what she had set in motion. By refusing to keep her father's secrets, by sharing the documented evidence of his behavior, she had essentially declared war on the carefully constructed narrative that held his new family together. Madison was questioning her stepfather's character. Patricia was mobilizing to protect their version of events. Robert would be forced to choose between acknowledging his failures and doubling down on his denials. Clara realized she was standing at the edge of a cliff she couldn't see the bottom of. Everything that happened next would depend on whether her father was capable of the kind of honesty and accountability she was demanding. And for the first time in her life, Clara was genuinely uncertain which outcome would be more devastating. Discovering that Robert was capable of change, but had chosen not to change for her, or confirming that he was incapable of the growth she needed from him. The breaking point wasn't just about her father anymore. It was about Clara's willingness to lose everything familiar in pursuit of something real.
The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Robert himself, though not in the way Clara had imagined it would happen. 2 weeks after Clara's conversation with Madison, she received a frantic phone call at 2:17 a.m. from a number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was slurred and panicked. Robert, calling from the emergency room at Mercy Hospital in San Bernardino, 40 miles from Riverside. "Clara, I need you to come get me," he said without preamble. "There's been an accident. Patricia's in surgery, and Madison is hysterical, and I don't know what to do." Clara sat up in bed, immediately alert, despite having been deep asleep moments before. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "Car accident. Drunk driver ran a red light and hit Patricia's side of the car. Robert's voice broke. "She's in really bad shape, Clara. They don't know if she's going to make it." The irony was so stark it took Clara's breath away. Here was her father, calling her from a hospital at 2 a.m., asking her to drop everything and drive 40 miles to help him during a family emergency. The same man who couldn't leave a wedding reception when she was facing life-threatening surgery was now expecting her to abandon her sleep, her safety, her own well-being to rescue him from a crisis. "Dad, where's Madison? Can't she drive you home?" "Madison can't. She's not handling this well. She keeps saying it's her fault because she was the one who suggested they go to that restaurant in San Bernardino. She's having some kind of panic attack. The nurses had to sedate her." Clara found herself getting dressed as she continued the conversation, muscle memory taking over while her mind processed the situation. This was what she had always done, responded to Robert's needs immediately, without question, without considering whether her help was being requested or demanded. But this time, as she grabbed her car keys and headed for the door, Clara was acutely aware of what she was doing and why. She wasn't coming because she expected gratitude or recognition or a fundamental change in their relationship. She was coming because it was the right thing to do, because this was who she had chosen to be, regardless of who her father was. The drive to San Bernardino gave Clara 45 minutes to think about the conversation she was about to have. For weeks, she had been preparing for Robert to respond to her boundary-setting letter with either genuine accountability or final rejection.
She had never considered that he might respond by needing her in a way that perfectly mirrored her own recent crisis. Mercy Hospital's emergency room was a chaos of Saturday night casualties. Drunk college students, victims of bar fights, families dealing with accidents and overdoses. Clara found Robert in the family waiting room, slumped in a plastic chair with his head in his hands, still wearing the expensive button-down shirt and khakis he'd worn to whatever dinner had preceded the accident. He looked older than she remembered, his hair thinner and grayer, his face carrying new lines of stress that made him appear vulnerable in a way Clara had never seen before. When he looked up and saw her approaching, his relief was so immediate and obvious that Clara felt her carefully constructed emotional boundaries waver. "Thank God you came," he said, standing to embrace her. "I didn't know who else to call. Madison's mom is in Denver visiting her sister, and Patricia's family is all in Arizona, and I couldn't think of anyone else." Clara accepted the hug, but didn't return it with the enthusiasm Robert seemed to expect. "How is Patricia doing?" "They're operating on her spleen and liver. The surgeon said the next few hours are critical." Robert's voice was hollow with exhaustion and fear. "Madison blames herself because the restaurant was her suggestion. She had some kind of panic attack when they brought Patricia in, and the doctor gave her something to calm down. She's sleeping in room 247. Clara nodded, taking in the information while trying to decide how to navigate the situation with integrity. She could play the part of the dutiful daughter, setting aside her recent revelations to provide unconditional support during a family crisis. Or she could maintain her new boundaries while still offering appropriate help. "I'll stay until Patricia's out of surgery, and you have a plan for getting home. But, Dad, we need to talk about the letter Rebecca sent you, about the recording and the custody papers I found." Robert's face immediately shifted from vulnerable gratitude to defensive irritation. "Clara, this is not the time. Patricia might be dying, and you want to rehash some conversation from weeks ago?" "This is exactly the time, Dad, because this is what medical emergencies look like. This is what it means to need your family to show up, and I'm here at 3 a.m. after driving 40 miles because I understand that people we love sometimes need us to drop everything and be present for their crisis." Robert stared at her, clearly struggling to process the parallel she was drawing. "That's completely different. Patricia is fighting for her life right now."
And I was fighting for my life 3 months ago. The only difference is that you chose to stay at a party instead of being here for me, the way I'm being here for you right now. The waiting room was too public for the conversation Clara could see building between them, but she also realized that public spaces had their advantages. Robert couldn't storm out dramatically or raise his voice without causing a scene that would reflect poorly on him. He was trapped in a situation where he would have to actually engage with her perspective instead of dismissing it. "Clara, please, I can't deal with this right now. I need you to just be my daughter right now. Be supportive." "I am being supportive. I'm here. I drove through the night to help you and Madison, but I'm not going to pretend that the last 3 months didn't happen just because it's inconvenient for you to deal with." Robert sat back down heavily, rubbing his temples. "What do you want from me? You want me to apologize for not dropping everything during Madison's wedding, for not psychically knowing that your stomachache was a serious medical emergency?" Clara pulled out her phone and opened the voice recording app she'd started using to document important conversations, a habit she'd developed after realizing how differently she and Robert remembered their interactions. "I want you to listen to yourself," she said, pulling up the Paramedics recording on her phone. "I want you to hear what you actually said to me while I was on my way to emergency surgery." She played 30 seconds of the audio, just the part where Robert explained to the paramedics that Clara was always dramatic and that Madison's wedding only happens once. In the context of the hospital waiting room, with Patricia fighting for her life just floors above them, Robert's dismissive tone sounded even more callous than Clara remembered. Robert's face went white as he heard his own voice. "Where did you get that? Who gave you permission to record our private conversation?"
The paramedics record all their emergency calls, Dad. It's hospital policy. I didn't ask for this recording. I have a right to it because it documents my medical care. That was taken out of context. You don't understand the pressure I was under that night trying to balance... No. Clara's interruption was quiet but firm. Don't explain it away. Don't minimize it. Just listen to yourself talking about your daughter's medical emergency like it was an inconvenience. For the first time in Clara's memory, Robert had no immediate response. He sat in the plastic chair, staring at Clara's phone, looking like a man confronting evidence of something he'd done but never expected to be held accountable for. The breakthrough wasn't Robert suddenly understanding the harm he'd caused or offering a heartfelt apology. The breakthrough was Clara realizing that she no longer needed his understanding or his apology to move forward with her life. I used to think that if I could just make you see how much you'd hurt me, you'd want to do better. I thought the problem was that you didn't understand the impact of your choices. But sitting here, watching you try to explain away documented evidence of your behavior, I finally get it. You do understand. You just don't care enough to change. Dr. Reynolds, the surgeon operating on Patricia, emerged from the elevator at 4:23 a.m. with news that Patricia had survived the surgery and was stable, but would need extensive recovery time. Robert's relief was immediate and overwhelming. Tears, gratitude, promises to never take anything for granted again. Clara watched her father's emotional response to Patricia's crisis and felt the final piece of her childhood illusions crumble. This was how Robert looked when someone he truly loved was in danger. This was the depth of concern, the intensity of focus, the desperation to help that he was capable of feeling. He had simply never felt it for Clara. As the sun began to rise over San Bernardino, Clara helped Robert arrange for Madison's transportation back to Riverside and made sure he had a way to get home once Patricia was moved to a regular room. She fulfilled every responsibility of a caring family member while internally processing the most liberating realization of her adult life. She didn't need Robert to validate her worth or acknowledge her importance. She didn't need him to become the father she deserved or to admit that he had failed her repeatedly. She needed to accept that his capacity for love was real, but limited, and that limitation had nothing to do with her value as a person. "Thank you for coming tonight," Robert said as they stood in the hospital parking lot, the morning light revealing how exhausted they both were. "I know things have been complicated between us lately." "You're welcome. I hope Patricia recovers completely." She didn't say she forgave him, and she didn't say they could go back to the way things were before. She didn't promise to forget about the recording or pretend that tonight's crisis erased the patterns revealed in the custody documents. As Clara drove home through the morning traffic, she understood that the breakthrough hadn't been about fixing her relationship with Robert. It had been about finally accepting that some relationships couldn't be fixed, only survived. And survival, Clara was learning, looked a lot like choosing yourself when nobody else will.
6 months after Patricia's accident, Clara stood in the conference room of Riverside Community Center, looking out at 12 faces that had become more familiar to her than many of her blood relatives. The family estrangement support group had grown since she'd first attended, and Clara had gradually transitioned from participant to co-facilitator alongside Dr. Lisa Rodriguez. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, Clara was sharing her story publicly for the first time, as part of the Community Center's monthly workshop series on building healthy boundaries in difficult relationships. The audience included social workers, nurses, teachers, and other professionals who worked with people navigating family trauma, as well as community members dealing with their own relationship challenges. Clara had never imagined herself as someone who would speak publicly about personal pain, but the months since her breakthrough had taught her that healing happened not just through individual growth, but through connection with others who understood similar struggles. The recording that had once felt like evidence of her father's betrayal had become something else entirely, proof that she had survived something that could have destroyed her sense of self-worth forever. "When I was lying in that hospital bed," Clara began, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her chest, "I thought my story was about a father who couldn't love his daughter enough to show up during a medical emergency.
but I've learned that my story is actually about a young woman who discovered she was strong enough to build a life based on truth rather than hope. In the front row sat Elena Vasquez, now officially Clara's medical emergency contact and surrogate grandmother figure. Beside her was Jennifer Martinez, whose friendship had evolved from professional concern to genuine sisterhood. Rebecca Patel occupied a seat near the back, having become not just Clara's lawyer, but her mentor in learning to advocate for herself in all areas of her life. Most surprisingly, Madison sat in the third row, her presence still somewhat tentative, but increasingly consistent. The months following Patricia's accident had been transformative for Madison as well, as she grappled with the realization that the stepfather she'd idealized was capable of profound emotional neglect toward his biological daughter. The hardest part wasn't accepting that my father had chosen a wedding over my emergency surgery. The hardest part was accepting that this choice wasn't an aberration or a mistake. It was consistent with a pattern of behavior that had been documented by courts and medical professionals for over a decade. The audience was completely silent, the kind of focused attention that told Clara her words were landing with people who had their own experiences, with family members who couldn't or wouldn't show up when it mattered most. Clara had structured her presentation around the concept of evidence-based relationships, the idea that healthy connections should be built on documented patterns of behavior rather than promises, explanations, or potential for change. She shared how the recording had become a tool not for revenge, but for clarity, helping her distinguish between the father she had hoped Robert would become and the father he had consistently chosen to be. I spent years making excuses for behaviors that had already been identified as harmful by family court judges and medical professionals. I was so invested in the idea of having a relationship with my father that I was willing to accept a relationship that actively damaged my mental health and sense of self-worth. During the question and answer portion of her presentation, a social worker named Mark Stevens raised his hand. How did you finally break the cycle of making excuses for him? What was the turning point? Clara considered the question, thinking back to all the moments that had led to her transformation, the surgery, the recording, the custody papers, the middle-of-the-night drive to help Robert during Patricia's crisis. I think the turning point was realizing that I was putting more effort in preserving our relationship than he was. I was constantly adjusting my expectations downward, accepting less and less, convincing myself that any attention from him was better than none. But when I heard that recording, when I had undeniable proof of how he spoke about me during the most vulnerable moment of my life, I understood that I was fighting for something that didn't actually exist. After her presentation, Clara was approached by several audience members who shared their own stories of family estrangement and boundary setting. A teacher named Angela Rodriguez described her journey of limiting contact with a mother who had spent decades undermining her self-confidence. A nurse practitioner named David Kim talked about documenting his father's promises and tracking which ones were kept versus which ones were broken, creating an objective record of their relationship's reality. Your story helped me understand something, Maria Santos, a social worker in her 50s, said. I've been working with families for 20 years, and I always focus on reconciliation and healing relationships. But sometimes the healthiest thing is accepting that a relationship can't be healed because one person refuses to acknowledge that it's broken. Clara nodded, recognizing the wisdom in Maria's words. The months since her breakdown taught her that healing didn't always mean fixing what was broken. Sometimes it meant building something entirely new from the pieces that remained. Her relationship with Robert had indeed changed, though not in the way either of them had expected. He continued to send occasional text messages and holiday cards, maintaining the appearance of a caring father without any of the substance. Robert responded politely but briefly, treating him with the same cordial distance she might show an acquaintance she occasionally encountered. Robert had never acknowledged the content of Rebecca's letter or the evidence Clara had presented. He had never apologized for missing her surgery or admitted that his behavior during her emergency had been inappropriate. Instead, he had simply proceeded as though none of it had happened, occasionally mentioning how stubborn Clara had become or how difficult she was being about minor family disagreements.
This response had initially frustrated Clara, but she had come to see it as a gift. Robert's inability to engage with accountability had freed her from the exhausting cycle of hoping he would change.
She no longer wasted emotional energy trying to make him understand her perspective or waiting for him to demonstrate growth. She simply accepted that he was who he was and built her life accordingly. The most unexpected development had been her evolving relationship with Madison. Patricia's recovery had been long and challenging, requiring months of physical therapy and ongoing medical care. During this time, Madison had begun to see more clearly how family crises revealed people's true priorities and capacities for care. "I keep thinking about what you said," Madison had told Clara during one of their monthly coffee meetings, "about how my wedding was more important to him than your life. And then when Mom was in the hospital, he called you at 2 a.m. without even thinking about it. He just automatically knew you'd drop everything to help him." These conversations with Madison had been healing in ways Clara hadn't anticipated. For the first time, she had someone who understood Robert's behavior patterns from the inside, someone who could validate Clara's experiences without Clara having to defend or explain them. Madison had also shared insights about Patricia's role in the family dynamics. "Mom only said you were jealous of our happiness, but now I realize she was probably threatened by you. You represented Dad's life before her, and she needed to minimize your importance to feel secure in their marriage." These revelations had helped Clara understand that her exclusion from Robert's new family hadn't been about her inadequacy or difficult personality. It had been about Patricia's need to rewrite Robert's history and Robert's willingness to let her do it. As Clara's presentation concluded and the audience began to disperse, she felt a profound sense of completion. Not because her story had a happy ending in the traditional sense. She and Robert would never have the close, loving relationship she had once hoped for, but because she had transformed her pain into purpose, her isolation into connection, her victimization into advocacy. Elena approached as Clara was packing up her presentation materials. "I'm proud of you, mija," the older woman said, her eyes bright with affection. "Your mother would be proud too. You took something that could have broken you and used it to help other people heal." Clara thought about Linda Jolie, about the custody protections her mother had fought for even while battling cancer, about the legal framework Linda had created to ensure Clara would eventually have proof of Robert's patterns. Her mother's final gift hadn't been protection from pain. It had been documentation that would help Clara understand the pain wasn't her fault. "I think she knew this day would come," Clara said, looking around the conference room at the people who had become her chosen family. "I think she knew I'd need proof that I deserved better." As Clara drove home that evening, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed. She had a career she was passionate about, having parlayed her graphic design skills into freelance work with nonprofits focused on family advocacy. She had a support network of people who showed up consistently and without conditions. She had romantic prospects, a fellow support group member named James who understood the complexities of rebuilding after family trauma. Most importantly, Clara had developed an internal compass that helped her recognize healthy relationships and avoid repeating the patterns that had kept her trapped in cycles of disappointment and self-doubt. She no longer waited for other people to choose her. She chose herself first and built connections with people who could meet her halfway. Her phone buzzed with a text from Robert. "Saw your name in the community center newsletter. Proud of you for speaking publicly. Love, Dad." Clara read the message and felt nothing. No anger, no hope, no disappointment. Just the neutral acknowledgement that Robert remained exactly who he had always been. Someone who could express pride in her accomplishments from a safe distance, but couldn't engage with the real work of relationship building. She typed back a simple response. "Thank you." And then Clara Jolie drove home to her apartment, to her cat Milo, to her chosen family of friends who had proven they would show up in crisis and celebration alike, to the life she had built not in spite of her father's limitations,
but because of what those limitations had taught her about her own strength. The recording that had once been evidence of her father's betrayal had become something else entirely. Proof that she was capable of surviving anything, even the loss of the relationship she had once believed was essential to her happiness. And that proof, Clara realized, was the foundation of every beautiful thing that would come next.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.